All right, so then I did Last Trip to Ashland in 1969, front page. It was about the East Coast's best abortion doctor who had just died. I wrote a lot about abortion for The Voice, a lot about abortion.
And were you one of the first people to write about abortion for The Voice?
I think I was the first person to write about abortion, but The Voice was always pro-abortion. Yeah, I mean, that was my impression. So Last Trip to Ashland, another abortion doctor who I knew, because I was writing about abortion, told me, we really ought to go up and see this guy because he's hasn't much longer to live. He was in Pennsylvania, and so I went with this other guy, and I did a long interview with him. And how did you become an abortion doctor? He said, well, there was a need. There was a need in the community. I'd been working on black lung. And then all these women would come to me and say, doctor, what can you do for me? I'm pregnant again. So he slowly discovered how to be an abortion doctor. He was a hero, Dr. Spencer. So I wrote the story, and it got on the front page. And Joe Flaherty, carped in the lion's head, I write all this serious stuff about the Brooklyn docks, and she gets on the front page for an abortionist. And, to me, that became, that was like The Voice. The Voice was a sniping, snarky family. Mm-hmm. Everybody was bitching about everybody else. Why that story got on the front page? And mine did. Another abortion story that I'm very proud of was the same year, 1969, called Every Woman's Abortions, The Oppressor is Man. Front page.
You wrote this one?
And this was a very significant speak out. It was the first time women had gotten together to speak out in a public space.
1969?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So you...
And they asked me if I'd testify, because I was already in the movement, the women's movement. But I still, because of what I thought journalism should be, you don't bring yourself into it, that's confessional, I said, I'll do y'all a favor, I'll write about it for the Village Voice. Even though I'd had 3 abortions of my own, but I didn't say that. But I wrote up the abortion speak out.
So I want to slow you down.
The speak out was amazing, but I discussed my abortions earlier in our first group in New York called New York Radical Women. That was the first group, and Kathy Sarachild, well, she was Kathy Amatnik then, was sort of the leader or a leader. And she'd say, let's go around the room. Okay, we'll go around the room. And she said, well, when you have a boy, when you are pregnant, when you are ready to have a baby, do you want a boy or a girl? I thought, that's really namby-pamby. And they started to go around the room, but they didn't get very far because a woman named Peggy Dobbins, whom I'm back in touch with, said, Kathy, we've discussed this several times. The last time you brought up this stupid question, I told you I had a baby, I had a boy, and I had to give him up because I couldn't find an abortionist. And then people are, now talking about abortion. I don't know. Another woman talks about her therapeutic abortion, which her parents had to find 2 doctors to agree that she was too mentally unstable to have a child. And that's how she got a legal abortion in New York. And she said, that's going to follow me for the rest of my life, that I was too unstable to have a child. And that's not what it was about. So they're going around and they're coming to me, and my normal competitiveness kicked in. I didn't know it would. And I said, I've had 3 illegal abortions. And I never told anybody, except those who needed to know, that I was going to go to, the first one was in Cuba. I'd gone down to see the revolution, but I had an abortion. And then 2 in Puerto Rico, same doctor. And as I'm starting to tell this story, I'm starting to cry, too. And a good friend of mine was there. We had been in Mississippi together. And I said, Jan, I never told you. You were my best friend. I never told you. So I realized at that moment that this women's movement was going to go places, that we were talking about stuff that was called personal. had never been articulated out loud before. So then, within a year or so, the Red Stockings women had their abortion speak out. And I was still, I'm not going to talk about mine. I did that once for y'all already. So I wrote it for The Voice. And it was a good thing because that was the only publicity that historic speak out got. And it was reprinted around the country.
In 1969.
Yep, 69.
When you were talking about making the personal, bringing you thought that journalism should
having an abortion and waking up and being alive was the main thing for me. Particularly the first one in Cuba, where I said I'd gone down to see the revolution in 1960.
There was no birth control at this point, really, right? Or no?
Well, the pill came along a little later, but there was too much estrogen and other stuff in the pill. The pills weren't very safe. I mean, men thought, that was sexual liberation. That was very different from women's liberation. Because the men suddenly thought, whoa, who needs condoms? These women just take a pill, And I never did that. Mm-hmm. Mm. Unfortunately for me, Spencer was never working. He'd been shut down when I needed an abortion. That's how I ended up in Puerto Rico, because I called him, Ashland 404. He said, I'm not practicing now because I've had some court trouble. But I can recommend some people, but I can't vouch for them. So, the first one I called was a woman in Harlem, black, obviously from her voice. And she said, she heard my voice, and she said, I don't think you'll like my method, I do packing. That was when they just put a needle in or something, try to stir the fetus a bit, and then pack it all in. You go home, and then the next couple of days, you start to miscarry. So I tried his second recommendation. That was a nut in Baltimore, a nut with a medical degree. And he was interested in late-term abortions, and he kind of wanted me to wait a couple of months so he could practice that on me, and I fled from his office. And then another person told me about her friend who was in Puerto Rico. And she just said, pack an overnight bag, don't tell anybody, and just go to this address. So I did that, went to the guy's address, he opened the door. And I said, I'm here for an abortion. And he showed me his hand, and it was palsy. He said, I haven't done abortions in a few years. So he recommended me to a poor person's clinic in San Juan. And I went there. The guy did the abortion. Asked for a lot of money. I said, I only have $300 because that's what I was told. Yes.
So was nobody,
but The Voice was always pro-abortion, I have to say.
Always.
Oh, it seemed to me.
Yeah. They
always printed my abortion stories.
What?
I went to one in. I was in. I took my first overseas trip. I went to England, and I found out that they were ready to pass a termination of pregnancy bill in England before us, and they did. They beat us on that. Well, the newspapers weren't yet onto it as a big subject. It's like I know that before Roe v. Wade, there were suits in 30 states against district attorneys, basically, to overturn the abortion bans. 30 states. I never read that in the New York Times. But it was happening. And the case that so the cases were getting thrown back to lower courts. And the argument was the women who signed it, some of these cases had 1,000 plaintiffs. The one in Massachusetts had 1,000 plaintiffs. And they were women who couldn't get an abortion in Massachusetts. They were women who'd had to have a baby and put it up for adoption in Massachusetts. They were women who thought maybe in the future I'll get pregnant, but I don't feel I would want a child. So they signed on to these complaints too. These massive class action lawsuits. And then the court chose Roe v. Wade, and it was a single plaintiff case. You know, it didn't carry all the baggage of the rest of it. It was, Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey, single plaintiff case. Unfortunately, the woman called Jane Roe, when it went to the Supreme Court, turned out to be Norma McCorvey, who was a terrible flake. And eventually, as you know, she turned on the movement. Yeah. So anyway, it was a struggle, like everything in women's rights is a struggle. Everything. There's a guy on Facebook who every day posts something about the suffrage movement, and it's inch by inch. It took 70 years to get women's suffrage. Yeah, well, it's my specialty, actually.
Yeah.
Because I saw what happened with Rafe, and I mean, with abortion, the day after Roe v. Wade was 1973 Roe v. Wade, and we thought the movement will never stop. The day after, they started cutting back on Roe v. Wade, and if you read, today, Ohio says after 6 weeks you can't have an abortion. I mean, all these states are now putting these anti-abortion legislation through. It's really frightening. And then you have Trump, who used to be for abortion, now he's against abortion.
Even for? Yeah.
It's very scary.
Yeah.
And I make the connection between what's happening with abortion rights and what's happening with justice in rape cases. It's the same thing. The same thing. They're just tearing down everything we did. Because they've never changed their mind.